what I want to talk about a little bit today is something that I talk about so often with not just the modernist sites, but historic sites around the country, which is how imperative it is that we allow these places to continue to evolve. You know, we are in so many cases the people who froze historic sites in a particular period, who put lots of restrictions on how we use them and how we manage them. We're the people responsible for that, and the result of it was a real dilemma in which you know, we saw, and I think have seen very vividly, that kind of restriction on these properties doesn't lead to their long-term sustainability, but also is in many ways diametrically opposed to their histories. This is not the way they were operated or maintained when they were private residences. So we're the people who froze them, and I feel like it is our responsibility to unfreeze them. And you see here some images of ways in which we have unfrozen our moderns. And I want to talk a little bit more about the work of wonderful colleagues across the National Trust portfolio of sites to do just this, to unfreeze these places, to allow them to continue to evolve. And I want to talk about it not only in terms of programming, but also in terms of preservation, in terms of their materiality as well. And again, I'm going to use some examples from wonderful, wonderful colleagues around the country at our sites. You know, I'd also say that I think the National Trust brings a particular level of credibility to this. We were among the first organizations to advocate strongly for the preservation of the moderns. We have been engaged with numerous advocacy campaigns around the country to preserve moderns that we ourselves don't own. Prentice Hospital being one of the most high profile and disappointing ones, but we were sort of the last organization standing as Prentice was demolished. We have a long history of, again, working to preserve the moderns. Our offices at the National Trust, as many of you may know, are in the Watergate. For us, that was a really important move from a Beaux-Arts building to a modern building, and one that we wanted to do, again, to continue to advocate for the preservation of moderns. We also have a portfolio that includes 4 modern properties, 2 of which y'all are going to visit. So the Glass House, of course, in New Canaan, Connecticut. Philip Johnson, a member of our Board of Trustees at the National Trust, and he and his partner David Whitney gave us a life estate to their property, and it has been in operation for 10 years now, 11 years, I guess. And the top right, Frank Lloyd Wright property, the Pope-Leighey House in Alexandria, Virginia, which the National Trust moved out of the path of destruction when I-66 in Washington, D.C. was being built, and we acquired it, moved it to one of our large sites, and preserve it there today. The Breuer House, which you're also going to see, which is at Kykuit. We own the Breuer House as we do the Kykuit property, but it is operated by our, what we call our co-stewardship partner, Rockefeller Brothers Fund. You guys are going to spend some time with them. Kimberly Miller, I think, will be probably giving you your tour. She's amazing. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the Breuer House. And then, of course, the Farnsworth House, which we also own in Plano, Illinois. As Greg can tell you, I take great amusement when we get our site directors together of pitting the directors of the Farnsworth House and the Glass House against each other as to who was first and who is more important, and they always take the bait, which I love. And so we are, I mean, at the National Trust, so proud to steward these properties. But again, to do so in a way that we think helps to allow them to continue to evolve, which is a lesson not just for the moderns, but historic sites around the country. We just started this process of strategic planning at the Glass House. We've been in operation, again, 10 years at the Glass House. Didn't really have a strategic plan, so we thought it would be a good idea to do this. And one of the first parts of that strategic plan was to survey our full-time staff, our management staff, our educators, and our advisory council. And I put this up here because we were so, I think, Greg, surprised and pleased at the level of alignment between all of those groups about the mission of the Glass House, And I put this up here to illustrate the fact that all three of those groups really get this idea of evolution, right? That our work at the Glass House is about preservation, but it is also about legacy. It is also about perpetuating what Philip Johnson and David Whitney did at the Glass House. And I think when we are true to legacies, it is much easier to let these places evolve. And often it's those legacies, it's those people who gave us, who entrusted us with these properties, when we look back at them, can really inspire how to let these places evolve. Because again, as I said, you know, so often they were letting these places evolve. We're the people who sort of stopped them from evolving. You know, we're so fortunate. I don't know if they're going to meet Brendan when you guys are at the Glass House, but we're so fortunate that our buildings and grounds manager at the Glass House literally started cutting the grass for Philip Johnson and David Whitney when he was like 11. I don't know. He was like in junior high school. And probably no one guards the legacy of Philip Johnson and David Whitney at the Glass House more closely than Brendan does, in a sort of physical way. And you know, sometimes we will get anxious about like moving a collection around, moving a collection item around. And it's so great to have Brendan who says, you know what? Sometimes it'd be snowing outside and Philip Johnson and David Whitney would say, go get the Warhol, put it in the golf cart, and bring it up here. So like when we get too precious about our collection and things like that, I think it is so important to remember that these places were always allowed to change and evolve, and there was a comfort with their world-class collections and with their significance, and pushing at the boundaries of how we manage those that we need to be true to, that existed in the past when they were private residences. So again, I think this evolution, and it's vividly demonstrated here by the Glass House, is really about being true to the legacies of these places, letting our operations be resonant with and respectful of their histories. I want to talk first about how we do this in terms of materiality at some of our properties. And I think actually this headline from a story we did at the National Trust and our Preservation Leadership Forum about the restoration of the sculpture gallery sums it up so beautifully: enhancing performance and maintaining design integrity. So I'm sure, Greg, y'all are going to see the sculpture gallery when you're there and talk about the restoration a little bit. So I won't go into it, but it was a $2 million restoration of this incredibly important gallery at the Glass House. Comprehensive restoration. But you know, this was really our guiding philosophy, this idea of enhancing performance but maintaining design integrity. And I think it is an excellent, again, way to sum up how you allow historic sites and moderns to continue to evolve, but in a way, again, that is respectful. So just one example, two examples of how we change things here. First of all, you see them taking out the skylight that is essentially the ceiling of the sculpture gallery, the essentially glass curtain wall that is the ceiling of that building. When Philip Johnson designed this, it was untempered glass. So as Greg knows, I used to call it the ceiling of death. I mean, it was terrifying, right? But so as we went through this restoration, I mean, we allowed ourselves, again, the freedom not to have to just sort of absolutely mimic what Philip Johnson had been doing, because of course he was using experimental materials himself. So we worked very closely with our supplier to find a tempered glass that would still mimic the light and the shadow and the color that Philip Johnson designed there, but to again add the safety of having a tempered glass. So I think it's really important to again keep this in mind. We also changed the way that, and I won't get too technical, but the way that the extrusions on the top shed water, because again, there is no reason we should be beholden, particularly with the moderns, right? These people were on the vanguard. They were experimenting with materials and designs in a really remarkable way, and I think they would want us to continue that as we try to preserve these buildings. Now, we were able to absolutely bring back this incredible lighting system, the cathode tube lighting system here, exactly, because the manufacturer was still making it. So you don't compromise on things like that, but there are places that I think it's important to let the materiality evolve. We've also just replaced the ceiling at the glass house. Again, there were things about this as we went through this process that we changed ourselves. For example, we're not going to have radiant heating in the ceiling of the glass house anymore. It's very clear that that system leaked pretty much from the beginning. So we've left the evidence of it there, some pieces of it, but we have not returned it, nor have we returned the asbestos in the ceiling to it. But at the same time, I mean, again, this was a very intense and careful preservation effort. But I think as we talk about places evolving, it's important to remember that allowing their materiality to evolve is a part of that, and that it can be done respectfully and in a way, again, that's so much like how their designers were originally working. Another example of evolution of our properties, our moderns, is the Farnsworth house, which sits on the Fox River, as many of you know, and has been over the years threatened by flooding in many different instances. It flooded almost immediately. And there's lots of debate about whether Mies, put it in the wrong place, miscalculated the floodplain, whatever. But the point is that it floods. And so we worked closely with Robert Silman engineers to develop a strategy using a simple hydraulic lift, really old and proven technology, to raise the Farnsworth house in the event of a flood. It was really important to us to preserve the design integrity of that house's relationship to the river, which was central to Mies's design. Now, not everybody agrees with this approach. Let me be very clear, but we have spent a lot of time studying what you do if you raise it, what you do if you move it, what you do if you build a barrier around it, and no other solution allows us to keep it in the same place exactly, but to protect it against these floods. Now, I think the debate about this is incredibly healthy, and I think, again, though, at its core is this idea that we can be respectful to the designer's intent here, but still allow these places to evolve in a way that preserves them. I want to switch gears briefly to programmatic evolution. And so I want to talk about a few examples, again, at our properties, particularly some that you guys are going to see. So this is the Breuer house at Kikett, of course, which was Marcel Breuer's house in the garden that Nelson Rockefeller purchased and then moved to Kikett. When Lawrence Rockefeller died, it came to the National Trust, as have each of the Rockefeller brothers' interests in Kikett. And so after owning it for some time, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and you'll meet Kim Miller, who ran this project, decided to restore it. But once it was restored, they made the decision not to just treat it like a house museum, but to make it a home for their residencies in a variety of different ways. Artists who are grantees of Rockefeller Brothers Fund have wonderful residencies here, but I'm going to highlight two other programs of residencies that you see here. First of all, two pictures of students from the Mexican Cultural Institute's Sculpture Conservation Program who come to Kikett, which is a great place if you're going to conserve sculpture, who come to Kikett every summer, spend 2 weeks in the Breuer house as they learn about sculpture conservation. And then you see a picture there, the larger picture is of Edgar Garcia from the city of, who works as a preservation planner in the city of Los Angeles. For 4 years now, the National Trust and Rockefeller Brothers Fund have created a preservation fellowship that brings a person to the Breuer house for 2 weeks every year to work on a project that furthers the future of preservation, that is very forward-looking in preservation. It's a remarkable fellowship, and this is Edgar working in the Breuer house. But again, here's this piece of cutting-edge design that's beautifully preserved, but continues to contribute to the dialogue around arts and preservation as a home for these residencies, not as a static house museum. So when you're seeing it tomorrow, I mean, or whenever you see it in 2 days, think about that as you're seeing it. It brings such a life to this place. Also, our installations and performances at the Glass House, which have, gotten so much attention. You might have read about them, but they have really been under Greg's leadership and under previous directors, as well as Hilary Lewis, who you guys are going to meet, who's our chief curator. these have been so important to how we continue the legacy of Philip Johnson and David Whitney, to make the Glass House a place for experimentation and to be on the cutting edge of art and design. And you see here just a few examples of that. You know, and I have to say that some of these ideas, particularly putting big orange polka dots all over the Glass House with Yayoi Kusama, you know, are again not something that everyone embraced. But here's the thing that I say constantly: even though these are glass houses, we are not going to break them. I mean, no great harm was done to the Glass House, and what happened was we generated international press. We were sold out in every event that we could have. Those dots peeled right off in the end, and everything was fine. And it brought, you see on the bottom, I think one of the Insta meets that we did, where we brought Instagrammers from all over the New York area to take pictures of the site. This was a huge event for us. Now, again, my boss, to be fair, at the National Trust did refer to this as that period when you gave the Glass House chicken pox. So again, not everybody took it as seriously as we did, but it turned out to be just a remarkable event for us. And you see here other design performances, Robert Indiana's 1 through 0 at the site, which were just remarkable installations. But I think it's important. This is not something we've always done at the Glass House. This really started, Greg, maybe 4 years ago, an intense program of works either performed there or performed there and commissioned and exhibited there. So this was a change for us, but it has been one that has yielded really, really important rewards for the National Trust. And lastly, I want to talk about the Farnsworth House and our programming there. Because, you know, at the Glass House, we're talking about really international programming, right? And we're talking about programming that really touches on the international art and design world. And that's incredibly important. But as Greg can tell you, at these iconic sites, it is also equally important that we maintain connections to our local communities. These places and their designers were always connected to these local communities. Philip Johnson ate at the Chinese restaurant in New Canaan like every day at lunch. You know, these places were always deeply connected to their communities. And again, sometimes I think in the past we almost take ourselves a little too seriously at the Moderns, and we decide that an international design audience is our only audience. And I think it's important to remember that we have to have an international audience, we have to have a national audience, we have to have a regional audience, and we have to have a local audience. And we have to be working to meet the needs of all of those different groups in different ways. For example, the Glass House has a wonderful Girl Scout badge now that they developed in cooperation with the New Canaan troop of Girl Scouts. At the Farnsworth House, you know, again, we in many ways have always focused on the sort of international audience there. And it is an amazing audience for us, and we appreciate it a great deal. But you know, the Farnsworth House is located in Plano, Illinois, which is about an hour outside of Chicago. And it is a very a rural area. It is an area where there is intense pressure, development pressure to turn, you know, cornfields into housing and things like that. But at the same time, Plano itself, while it has a historic downtown, is an economically challenged area. And so it has become really important for us to build relationships and build programming with that local community. And so we've done that in a number of ways. You see our very popular yoga series here at the property. But what I want to end with is our local concert series. So for the past 3 summers, we've developed a local concert series that brings local musicians to the Farnsworth House to play, and is primarily attended by the local community. It has been a great way to, again, build a stronger connection between this international icon of design and the local community in Plano. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that that is a one-sided relationship, right? That we're just the Farnsworth House and they're just benefiting from the fact that we are there, and out of our largesse are allowing them to have a concert series there. It works both ways. we are enriched. Our partnerships, our operations, and our interpretation are enriched by that relationship with the Plano community. And I want to end with this example. So this concert series was going on, and the music was playing, and everyone was having a wonderful time, and it started to rain. Without any prompting, this audience, so the musicians, as you see, are playing up there under the thing, so they're covered. Without any prompting, this entire audience got up and moved underneath the Farnsworth house, and the concert continued. Can you imagine a more fantastic place to listen to music than during a rainstorm underneath the Farnsworth house? Did Mies van der Rohe or Edith Farnsworth ever have that idea? No. But the local community of Plano that night showed us a whole new way to experience that place. And in doing so, they helped us to continue to allow that place to evolve. And that is the lesson I want to leave you with, that it's not just okay to let these places evolve, it is imperative to let these places evolve. If our historic sites, whether they are moderns or not, are going to continue to be financially and culturally sustainable, we have to let them do this. And I would argue that their owners and their designers would expect us to do it as well. So I'll finish there. Here's my contact information. We love to stay in touch. I'm happy to answer questions or think further about this. You know, as I say to audiences, so we at the National Trust, we love this picture of Edith Farnsworth, where she is just like, it's over for her at the Farnsworth house. She is just, she's done. And managing historic sites and house museums can feel like Edith Farnsworth feels right now, right? In this picture. And so, you know, what I tell folks all around the country is we are in this together. How we help historic sites and house museums continue to evolve in ways that makes them sustainable is something the National Trust is deeply engaged in, but we're engaged in it not just at our own historic sites, we're engaged in it through historic artists' homes and studios, through our grant programs, through our advocacy campaigns in lots of different ways, and we are all in this together. Historic sites and house museums and historical societies are the largest category of American museums. Almost half of all American museums fall into that category. This is a critical way that the United States has chosen to preserve its cultural capital, if you will, and we are in this together. So please don't hesitate to reach out, follow us on Instagram, tag your pictures when you're at the Breuer house and the Glass House with our trust sites. And thank you so much. With that, I'll turn it over to Chandler. Oh, I didn't know.
We have time for some questions, if anyone would like to ask.
Great. Sure, go right ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you for the support you gave to Yale and to the Painted Desert project. I'm wondering whether you're keeping track of the business model of different places, and whether people are kind of tracking and seeing the pros and cons of different things, and best practices, and stuff like that.
Thank you. So can you want me to repeat the question? So first of all, he thanked the National Trust for our grant support, which some of you have come up to me today already to do, and you're very welcome. We take that ability to provide really early funding. It's not always huge dollars, but early funding to folks. We take that ability to do that really, really seriously. So you're very welcome, and we're so grateful for all the wonderful projects that come our way. The question was about how we're tracking business models and their success. And I'll tell you, I didn't go deeply into this today, but allowing our business models at our sites to evolve is critically important, and it takes many different forms. And yes, we are tracking it, and it's something that we're certainly networked among our own properties about, historic artists' homes and studios as well, and it's something we try to share with the larger field, particularly through our Preservation Leadership Forum and other online and written resources. But we need to do more of this because I think it's such an urgent issue. Allowing these places to continue to evolve in how they operate is so critically important. You know, Greg, I'm sure will make sure you go to the design store at the Glass House, but allowing that sort of business, allowing that our on-site design store as well as our online store to continue to evolve and change really radically at points has been so important to its success. I know you are from Monterey, from California, from Carmel. And so, you know, out there, I would say, is our most radical attempt to change a business model, where at a historic site in Monterey, we've actually, where we have several buildings in the middle of a downtown commercial building, we have partnered with a for-profit developer to bring commercial uses back to that property, to adaptively reuse historic buildings on the properties as a restaurant and as a bakery and as an event center. But we're the developer, so their ground leases and the participation in the success of those businesses comes directly into the National Trust as the equity partner in the development entity and goes right back out to support preservation and operations of the museum pieces of that property. So, you know, allowing these models to evolve is critically important, whether it's one portion of your model, like your shop, or whether it's the whole operating model, like what we're doing at Cooper Malera. We are tracking it, but your question is an excellent reminder to make sure that we continue to do so and disseminate those lessons. Thank you, Mr. Neutra. Other questions? Anybody? Oh, yes.
Have you had any instances of the over-success and thereby the threatening? I mean, I'm citing an example in Sydney where a particular site, the Rose Sideland,
Right.
sponsored a 50s and 60s fair, which became so popular.
Right.
It actually had to be discontinued.
Right.
Because the site couldn't cope with the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people that flooded in. I mean, it was a successful idea, but...
Understood. You know, I mean, I sort of have two answers to that question. First of all, and this is something we talk about in the Historic Sites Department at the National Trust a lot. First of all, I think that sites are so often, again, this is not just the moderns, this is all historic sites. They are so often hindered in this evolution by what we call the myth of overuse, which is to say that I think you can manage creative uses of your sites in ways that do not harm them. And that so often we are so afraid of overuse, even in the absence of use, that we don't let ourselves use them. And so we really do try to push back on the idea, this what we call the myth of overuse, that as the stewards of these places, we can manage their use in ways that are still protective of them. Now, having said that, the illustration you give is a really good one, and I think in that case, a steward knows when it's time to end an event. You know, so many of our sites, and we have a site in Cedar Rapids, Iowa that's been Bruce Moore, it's been such a leader in this because it does tons of arts programming, you know, 10,000 people on the lawn every year to hear the Iowa Symphony, that kind of thing, right? And they are very careful about, with each of their large events, doing a very thoughtful return on investment after each year's performance that looks at both the tangible and intangible returns and costs, and not just monetary costs, but also the costs associated with other things. Other costs, like cost to the site itself. And again, I think it's absolutely right to stop an event when those calculations get out of whack, and it sounds like that's what happens here. But at the same time, I think that as stewards, we know when to make those decisions. And so we also argue strongly that the myth of overuse should not keep us from experimenting and trying to draw people to these places. Yes?
How do you see your mission? And I'm thinking, do you see yourself having stewardship of these houses in perpetuity?
Yes.
Or
Yes.
Can you repeat?
Right. So, sorry. Thank you, Chandler.
You'll hold on to them, and then when they get financially or better back to scratch, let them go onto their own bottom.
Well, so let me repeat the question and then I'll answer it. So he's asking, do we own these places in perpetuity? What do we consider to be our long-term obligations to them? Do we get them financially healthy and then let them go? So the answer to the first question, yes, we own these places in perpetuity. I mean, we promised Philip Johnson we would own the glass house forever, and that's what the deed says, and that's what we're going to do. I mean, we honor those obligations absolutely and without question. Now, in terms of, though, getting them healthy, and I talked to some folks at lunch about this, we do believe in what we call the co-stewardship model at the National Trust, which is that the National Trust has a big national board chaired by Tim Whalen from the GCI, and they are a big national board who works with the National Trust in many different things that it does. We own historic sites. We have field offices that run advocacy campaigns. We run national grant programs. We have a government relations team that works with Congress. We run large marketing campaigns, all those different things. And that national board, provides governance for all of the things that I think our budget's about $46 million does, right? That kind of national board cannot provide the kind of local connection and oversight that a local board can as well. And so our ultimate goal with our sites is that they be financially self-sufficient and operated by local boards. We will always continue to own them, to steward them, to provide funds for the stewardship of the properties, and to provide technical expertise on them, and to make them a part of the mission of the National Trust. We just ran a capital campaign and had 3 pillars, and pillar 1 was our historic sites, So yes, they are always going to be a part of what we do. But, I mean, we have 70 years of experience running these places, and what we know is that if you're going to ask people at the local level to contribute to these places financially and raise money for them, you also have to be able to give them local governance, and that's really important to us. And so, again, at about half of our sites, we have co-stewardship partners. Rockefeller Brothers Fund at Kikit is an excellent example. And then we have other sites that we are still operating ourselves. The Glass House is one of those. There we have an advisory council, and we're working to develop a board there who could govern that site for the long term. But the National Trust will never stop owning it or stewarding it. We have just added to our portfolio, we just added site number 28 in San Marino, California, Thornton Gardens. It is a beautiful property, Tudor revival with a really significant garden and landscape, which filled a sort of stylistic hole in our portfolio, and also brought a really interesting Southern California property. We've never owned a property in Southern California. So we do acquire new sites, but that was the first site the National Trust has acquired in more than a decade. So it is a serious, serious commitment, and our Board of Trustees takes it very seriously. Have to come with endowments that are sufficient, and they have to fit into our larger vision for our historic sites. Other questions? Yes, sir. Sure. Right.
So, and discussion is very tough.
I'm sorry?
Discussion is very tough. There's a lot of criticism, most of them from architects and from foreign architects who come to Brazil to see the original.
Right, understood.
So, how it is, who is against?
Right. So he's asking me sort of who is against changes at historic sites. And Greg has heard me say this about 900 times. We do preservation projects ongoing at all of our sites, right? Drayton Hall, oldest example of Palladian design in the colonies. We are doing preservation projects ongoing there, and at the same time we're doing them at the Glass House, right? People come to Drayton Hall to see those preservation projects, and they are like, yes, this is amazing. We love watching preservation in action. People come to the Glass House and we're doing preservation, they are furious. I mean, I hate to pick on the moderns, but visitors to the moderns do not like things that don't look like the textbook in which they studied this. Do you know what I'm saying? And Greg and his staff, and maybe y'all can talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but you know, they have some really good strategies for mitigating that when we've had to do conservation projects that either just mean that the site doesn't look like, you know, again, like you saw it in that architecture textbook the first time you ever saw it. And again, not picking on the moderns, but I think modernist visitors have more trouble with this than maybe other historic sites. I'm probably gonna get in trouble for that. But you know, I think the other thing you can do is, I think the other thing we try to do is be very thoughtful and very intentional about changes that we make, and we try to, even if they are temporary, we try to be very careful about explaining them in advance, explaining them thoroughly, explaining the philosophical underpinnings of them, as well as what we're doing and the sort of immediate need. And you know, I think that tends to help. I mean, I think the more that we can convey to the public why it is imperative to allow these places to evolve, the more supportive they are of it. I mean, I often find that, you know, those people who are critical of it, there's a small percentage of them who are never going to come around. But you know, we are faced with the need to preserve these places and make them sustainable for the long term, financially and culturally. And to me, that is the largest obligation. That stewardship obligation trumps everything else. And sometimes it means that someone is disappointed. But I do think that, and Greg and Hilary can talk about this a little bit more when you guys are on site, but I do think there are strategies you can use in the moment to mitigate it. When we had the painting gallery closed, we actually did these videos of Philip Johnson talking about the painting gallery, and no one wanted the videos to go away when they were done. I mean, they actually became like an interpretive tool people really enjoyed. You know, we also, again, tried to be very, and they'll talk about this some more, very thoughtful about the ceiling replacement and explaining in advance to people what had happened. And we're actually now, we've commissioned an artwork that uses a piece of the old ceiling. Jorge Ortega Palos is doing a piece of artwork that, that does that as well. So that piece continues to live at the same time, you know, we accomplished our stewardship. But I think being intentional in how you explain it and thoughtful and explaining it not only from a stewardship standpoint, but sort of philosophical standpoint helps. But I also just sometimes accept that some people, modernist visitors, may be just disappointed beyond all reason. Yes?
But I thought he was especially referring to the art project, not the restoration of
Sure.
the art project.
I think the same thing applies, though, which is to say that not everybody thought it was a great idea to put polka dots all over the Glass House. And, you know, they were not afraid to tell us so in the comments section in the New York Times or other places. We felt like that project had resonance with the history of the site, and we were intentional about explaining that in advance and when you were there. And that's just, you know, I think that's part of letting them evolve, is that we have to occasionally disappoint people. And I just think, again, keeping these places sustainable trumps everything else. And I will talk all day long to explain that to people. And it's so imperative that you know, we're just not backing off of it. Let's see, over here, then I'll go back over there.
Thanks for the talk, it's fantastic. We know that heritage tourism is growing.
Yeah.
Portion of tourism.
Totally.
And you've spoken about sustainability. I'm interested, you know, in the 4 models that you manage, have you seen an incredible growth in tourism? I mean, we manage Roadside the House,
Sure.
the one that we've just spoken about, and they're not huge numbers, but we've seen much greater rise in that than our 19.
We see the same thing. We see the same thing across our portfolio and have for about the last 4 years, that we are seeing increases in visitation everywhere. except maybe the glass house, which is governed by a very restrictive permit. But no, even the glass house, I mean, I think what's important at the glass house is they've continued to actually grow revenue and their visitation under, again, which I'm sure Greg will talk about a little bit, sort of restrictions within the local area, and we certainly deal with those. But across the portfolio, I mean, again, I think it's one of the outcomes of trying this intentionally to stay relevant, is that we are attracting all sorts of different audiences to our properties. And I was talking with folks at lunch, and I think, one of the greatest areas of growth for us has been landscapes. I don't think there's an area of greater untapped potential or greater recent growth in terms of engaging people, engaging visitors, engaging new audiences, engaging funders, engaging individual donors than our landscapes. So, I think it's about always looking for what's that part of the place that you haven't engaged with as much, and looking for what are the areas of untapped potential, whether it's having artists there or, new walking trails or things like that. But no, we see the same thing, and I think it is incredibly heartening and speaks to the power of place. Should I wrap up? Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you so much.